She was Henry VIII's fifth wife and arguably the most tragic Tudor queen. A minor member of one of England's greatest families, she unexpectedly climbed all the way to the top of society, only to fall from grace in the most brutal fashion less than 18 months later, ultimately meeting a grisly end in the Tower of London. This is the life of Katherine Howard. For a woman who would become Queen of England, married to perhaps its most infamous monarch, we know shockingly little about almost all of Katherine Howard's life. She was the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard, a younger son of the second Duke of Norfolk, and Jocasta or Joyce Lee, née Culpepper. Her father's sister was Lady Elizabeth Howard, mother of Anne Boleyn, making Katherine and Anne first cousins. We don't know for sure where Katherine was born, though one biographer, Gareth Russell, argues for the parish of Lambeth in Surrey, where her father had employment. Lydia Antonia Fraser speculates that her early childhood might have been spent at Oxenhoath, where her mother's brother lived. The earliest definite proof we have of her existence comes from mid-1527, when she appeared in the will of her maternal grandmother, Isabel Lee, who left her 20 shillings. However, other evidence suggests, on balance, that she likely arrived in the world somewhere between 1521 and the autumn of 1523. I already have a video looking at this question in depth, which I'll leave linked on screen and below for you if you'd like to understand better why I've settled on those dates. Despite her excellent pedigree, Katherine was not well off by aristocratic standards. She was one of a large family with 5 half-siblings from her mother's first marriage and anywhere from 5 to 10 full siblings. Different books I read gave different numbers. Her father was also pretty hopeless, always in debt and unable to support his wife and large brood of children. Her mother died in 1528 or 1529, and she gained a short-lived stepmother named Dorothy Troyes, who seems to have died in the summer of 1530. Her father was then given a job in Calais and set off for France in 1531, marrying for a third time and leaving Katherine and her brother Henry in the care of their step-grandmother, Agnes, Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. The Duchess lived at Chesworth House in the village of Horsham, Sussex, and at her London residence, Norfolk House in Lambeth. Katherine's time with the Duchess was intended to be spent getting an education fit for a lady of her rank, and learning the kind of polish she would need to be able to manoeuvre her way through court at some point. After all, as well as being a Howard, she was also by this stage the first cousin of the King's mistress and future queen. Unfortunately, her years in Agnes's household would ultimately prove to be her undoing. She and the other noble girls under Agnes's care slept together in a kind of dormitory situation, rather than having their own chambers, and years later it would emerge that they had been behaving in anything but a ladylike manner there. In fact, David Starkey calls it akin to a slackly run mixed boarding school, though Antonia Fraser is kinder, labelling it as a high-class finishing school. One of the tutors engaged for the girls in 1536 was a young man named Henry Manox, who taught music alongside another man called Barnes. However, despite this chaperoning, at some point Manox and Katherine began a romantic relationship. The Duchess found out when she happened upon the two of them kissing near Chesworth Chapel, and she hit Katherine and ordered the two of them to cease their relationship and not be alone together. They didn't comply and were still an item in early 1538, when Manox made the disgusting but telling comment that "I have had her by the word I can't say or I'll get demonetized, and I know it among 100, and she loves me and I love her, and she hath said to me that I shall have her maidenhead, though it be painful to her, not doubting but I will be good to her hereafter." This shows the two had not already slept together, and when Katherine heard what Manox had said about her, she broke things off. Gareth Russell argues that he was probably no more than 5 years older than Catherine, and that the relationship, in an era when girls were considered to be of marriageable age at 12, did not amount to abuse, even if he wasn't particularly chivalrous in his dealings with her. It's an issue which continues to be debated, however, given her youth at this point. By 1538, she was still no more than 17 at most, and perhaps only 15. One thing we can say is that Agnes should have been doing a much better job of watching over her young charges. Catherine soon moved on, and her next beau was her grandmother's secretary, Francis Dereham. With him, the physical relationship was apparently much more serious than with Manox, though both he and her told one of the other girls staying in the house, Lambeth in this case, who expressed concerns about what they were doing, that they knew how to ensure Catherine didn't end up pregnant. Catherine got a copy made of the key to the maiden's chamber, so that Dereham and other men of the household could visit her and the other girls at their leisure, and the extent and the consensual nature of the relationship with Dereham cannot be doubted, as it was conducted in front of the other young women who shared the dormitory. They even carried on together, if you know what I mean, when one of Catherine's roommates was in the bed with them, for the young women would often share their beds, though of course there weren't meant to be any men in there with them. Eventually, the entire household knew about Catherine and Dereham, and it wasn't long before they were in trouble. Manox was jealous that his ex had moved on to seemingly greener pastures, and he made a failed attempt to alert the Duchess with a vague and anonymous letter, but eventually Agnes, who seems to have been exceptionally unobservant, found out about the couple anyway, when she walked in on them embracing. She hit both of them and went into a rage, but didn't seem to realise how far the relationship had progressed, and as with Manox, she didn't remove Dereham from his position, or send Catherine away. This was another serious oversight on her part. The pair continued to see each other, exchanging small gifts and even calling one another husband and wife. There was never any chance of a lowly servant being allowed to marry a Howard, of course, but as Russell correctly points out, their talk of marriage, plus the consummation of their relationship, might have been enough by 16th century standards to make them wed, though both would later deny that they had been. Still, Fraser speculates that they may have been pre-contracted and that Catherine probably, quote, considered herself betrothed to Dereham. Ultimately, she realised that she wasn't interested in being shackled to him, though, and broke off their relationship in 1539, much to his chagrin, for he seemed to look on her as his. An awful lot of people knew about this messy relationship, though, and it, as well as the Manox flirtation, would come back to haunt the future queen just a few years later. 1539 would prove to be a pivotal year in Catherine's life in other ways too. Her father died in March, leaving her an orphan. Then, at the end of the year, her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, secured her a post as a lady-in-waiting to the most recent of Henry VIII's wives, Anne of Cleves. Catherine was probably at court by November, ready to receive her new mistress, though bad weather meant that Anne didn't arrive until December, with the marriage taking place on the 6th of January 1540. It was immediately apparent that it was a disaster. Henry had taken umbrage against Anne the very first time they met, and actually tried to get out of the wedding altogether. When he could not, he went through with it with a very bad grace, and it was seemingly never consummated. Instead, Henry's affections became almost immediately fixed upon Catherine herself, with her step-grandmother later claiming that he desired her from the first time he saw her. But what did Henry see when he looked at Catherine? Again, I have a whole video on the potential portraits of her, which I'll leave linked on screen and below for you, but the ones which are the most likely to be her are two variations of the same image, one held at Windsor Castle, the other by the Duke of Buccleuch. They show her with auburn or chestnut-coloured hair, a pale complexion, hooded eyes, and wearing the Tudor consort necklace, which can also be seen in images of most of Henry's other wives. These pictures, now held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Yale Centre for British Art, may also depict her. One of those who saw her in person, the French ambassador Charles de Marillac, described her in August 1540 as being moderately pretty but with superlative grace. She was small and slender in stature, with a delightful countenance, and like her cousin Anne before her, she loved to dress in the French style, just as we see in this portrait in which the sitter sports a French hood. It seems that Henry saw a pretty and vivacious teenage girl, perhaps not a great beauty, but certainly pleasing enough to the eye. The king did not immediately make a move on Catherine. He would have seen her in November, remember, but didn't realise until January that he had no interest in his new German wife. And so she had a brief time as a lady of the court, with a salary of £10 per year. She lived with the Queen, which meant that she was initially at Greenwich Palace, and it was while she was in Anne's household that she met two people who would ultimately be central to her downfall, but neither of whom we have any pictures of. One was another lady-in-waiting, who was also Catherine's cousin-in-law, Jane Boleyn, Viscountess Rochford, widow of George Boleyn, whose sister was Anne Boleyn. The other was a very distant cousin named Thomas Culpepper, who was one of the king's gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, and a man who it seems had previously been accused of murder and of forcing himself on a married woman, unless the one source which relates these crimes was wrong or confused him with someone else. With Thomas, Catherine seems to have struck up a flirtation very quickly, and rumours that they would marry made it back to Francis Dereham, though in actual fact it seems that Thomas didn't run after her to the same extent that Francis had done, and Catherine shot down any discussions of marriage when asked about them, saying that it was all news to her. Had the king's initial interest in her not revived after the Cleves marriage fell flat on its face, it is probable that this dalliance with Culpepper would never have mattered. Russell makes the interesting point that while Catherine's family, especially her uncle Norfolk, are often blamed for positioning her in front of Henry and using her to revive their fortunes after the loss of Anne Boleyn, in actual fact, had they had a plan to get one of their women into his bed, it wouldn't have been her, with her disreputable background, which would ultimately lay them all open to danger. Instead, Henry seems to have gone after her entirely of his own volition, and the Howards were left responding to the situation as it unfolded, rather than steering it. It's easy to say now that had she or her family been wiser, they would have tipped Henry off, perhaps even anonymously, to the fact that she was not chaste enough to be considered for the position of Queen of England, and to blame the fact that they didn't do so on the lure of the throne. But on the other hand, it was virtually impossible to turn down the king. Catherine had been able to break things off with Manox and Dereham when she wanted to, and the flirtation with Culpepper had seemingly fizzled out, but with Henry, her only viable exit when he was proposing marriage would have been to divulge information which would have ruined her. I would argue that she was in a catch-22, and far more trapped in her dealings with him than with the previous men. Dereham, at least, had gone off to Ireland in a huff, and without the Duchess's permission, once he discovered that the king was interested in Catherine, though he left the substantial sum of £100 in her care, suggesting that he still viewed her as bound to him, even if not quite his wife. Manox remained in Agnes's employ, and Culpepper, as we've seen, was in the royal household. Catherine's position as the king's new mistress was becoming evident to onlookers by April 1540, when she was granted the goods of 2 condemned criminals. He bought her other gifts too, and soon, for appearance's sake, her family took her back to Lambeth, where the king visited her. He dumped Anne in June, had the marriage annulled in mid-July, and Parliament quickly passed an act allowing him to marry a woman even if he had already had relations with her or any of her close relatives. This got the couple around the problem that Henry had previously been married to Catherine's cousin, Anne Boleyn, and had had at the very least a liaison, if not a full-blown affair, with another cousin, Mary Boleyn. It might also suggest that Henry and Catherine had themselves engaged in some indiscreet behaviour. Fraser certainly believes the relationship was consummated while Henry was still married to Anne of Cleves, and there were false rumours in July that Catherine was already pregnant. The two were married privately on the 28th of that month at Oatlands Palace in Surrey. Henry was 49, Catherine was at most 19, and perhaps as little as 16 depending on when in the year her birthday fell. On the day of their wedding, his former favourite, Thomas Cromwell, was beheaded, having been instrumental in the failed Cleves union. The couple went on a hunting trip for their honeymoon, and the marriage was announced to the public on the 8th of August. After her honeymoon, much of Catherine's early marriage was spent on a royal progress, and they were only back at Windsor Castle on the 20th of October 1540. Henry seemed deliriously happy with her. Onlookers noted that he fawned over her far more than he had over her predecessors and showered her with gifts, while she took as her motto the phrase, "No other will but his." She was never a political animal in the way that Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and later Catherine Parr would be, nor did she have their interests in religion or their famed intellectual prowess. She had evidently been taught reading, writing, music, and dancing, and she will have been raised a Catholic, but we can't go much further than that when discussing her education. She showed little to no interest in closely managing the estates given to her upon her marriage to provide her income, though that is hardly surprising, as she would not have been taught how to manage such property, nor had she had the chance to see a parent or an earlier husband do so. She did show some aptitude for charity, interceding in the spring of 1541 to have 2 prisoners, including Thomas Wyatt, who was famously enamoured of Anne Boleyn, released from the Tower, rather than being executed. There was an awkward reunion at Hampton Court Palace at New Year 1541, when Anne of Cleves, now given the honorary position of the king's sister, came to court for the festivities. The ex-queen's former lady-in-waiting was now her superior, and Catherine was at first unsure what the etiquette was for this unprecedented occasion. Bear in mind that none of Henry's other wives had ever had to formally welcome their predecessors, and his actual sisters had been Queen's Consort of Scotland and France. Anne, it was now claimed, had never held any such rank in England. Both women opted for over-the-top civility, with Anne addressing the woman who had supplanted her on her knees, even as Catherine begged her to stand. Together they managed to muddle through before Henry entered and took them to dinner. After that, he went to bed, and his ex-wife and his current spouse danced the night away together. They did the same the following night, and Catherine even gave Anne 2 puppies and a ring which the king had just given her. If only things had gone as smoothly with the other adult royal female in the family who Catherine had to deal with. Henry's eldest daughter Mary was several years older than the new queen, and the 2 women had a difficult relationship. Mary did not treat Catherine with the deference that Catherine felt she deserved, and the queen hit back by almost having 2 of Mary's maids removed from her service. Initially, the princess managed to smooth things over and keep her ladies, but it seems that relations quickly deteriorated again, and Catherine did have the 2 women removed in early 1541. Shortly after, one of them died, which caused Mary great distress. Relations with her other stepchildren, who actually were children and so were easier to manage, were much better. Princess Elizabeth, of course, was also the daughter of Catherine's cousin, and so she may have felt a greater affinity for her. She visited the 7-year-old in May 1541 at Chelsea Old Palace, and gifted the little girl some inexpensive necklaces. Incidentally, I do know that Mary and Elizabeth weren't referred to as princesses at this point, but in the interests of clarity I'm going to call them that. As for Prince Edward, then aged 3, Catherine met him a few days later at Waltham Holy Cross in Essex, where he was then living with Princess Mary, and again, things went well. Other areas of Catherine's life were also a success. She had left Hampton Court in March 1541 to make her first formal entrance into London on the 19th of that month, for which a large river pageant on the Thames was staged for her. She then set up house at Greenwich Palace, and in April told Henry the thing he surely wanted to hear the most. She believed she was pregnant. Sadly for her, for a successful pregnancy with a boy probably would have secured her position, little is ever heard of it again, and it seems she was either mistaken or had an early miscarriage. The possibility that she was lying seems unlikely to me, as she had so little to gain by an untruth which would so quickly be found out and potentially call her fertility into question. There was never any serious talk that she had conceived again, and if you see my video on the fertility problems of Henry and his queens, you can hear a discussion of the potential problems on the king's side of things. This rumoured pregnancy was also the only time there was real talk of having Catherine crowned queen, an event which ultimately never happened. Her youth, the lack of oversight she had experienced during her childhood, and her lack of court experience showed in Catherine's dealings with her household. She did not censure one of her ladies-in-waiting, Dorothy Bray, for having an affair with a married man, though she was supposed to be caring for the morals of her ladies and helping them to make good matches. When they acted poorly, it reflected poorly on her. Evidently, the young consort didn't understand or didn't care about what was expected of her, and was prepared to let her ladies carry on in the same way that she had at Horsham and Lambeth, not taking into consideration that she was now the Queen of England and was meant to adhere to much higher standards. Catherine's past caused her far bigger problems than her lack of training in how to conduct herself at court, however, but so far they had been well hidden. When one of her old friends from the Duchess's household, Joan Bulmer, found out that she was to become queen, she wrote asking to be brought to London to serve in the royal household. Russell argues that while most historians have taken this letter as proof that Catherine did make this unwise appointment of a woman who knew all her dirty secrets, in actual fact there is no evidence that Bulmer was employed. Other servants from Chesworth and Lambeth were gradually brought into royal service, though, with the assistance of the Duchess of Norfolk and Catherine's aunt, the Countess of Bridgewater. This was possibly in an effort to buy their silence by making their own success and security dependent on Catherine's, but it would ultimately backfire. Lady Rochford also stayed on at court, now as one of Catherine's many female attendants. Far more problematic was the reappearance of the loose-tongued and impetuous Francis Dereham, who the Howard family tried to keep quiet about his past with Catherine by re-employing him, though not, Russell says, as Catherine's secretary, as some earlier historians have claimed. She did agree to meet with him, perhaps to try to soothe him into keeping his mouth shut, but he did not join her household, at least not yet. Also in her orbit was Thomas Culpepper, and in the spring of 1541 their initial attraction took a turn and became something more. Before we get into the details though, if you're enjoying this content, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel with the notification bell switched on so that you get a little ding every time I upload. You can also join me on Patreon to get bonus material including early access to ad-free videos, mini podcasts and blog posts, plus my back catalogue of bonus items. This week, my upper-level patrons are also getting my review of Russell's biography of Katherine Howard. Finally, I have an Amazon storefront where I've gathered together recommendations for history-themed books, TV shows, movies, and other items. Both are linked in the description box below for you, as is my Instagram account. Thank you too to those of you who donate to the channel using the thanks button underneath videos, as your generosity is always greatly appreciated. Katherine and Culpepper met on Maundy Thursday, i.e. the 14th of April, 1541, in a rendezvous facilitated by Lady Rochford, and Katherine gave him a gift of a cap, though he wasn't particularly grateful and questioned why she hadn't shown such interest in him before her marriage. This lukewarm response put her off him for some time, but by late spring Katherine was sending him platters of food when he was ill. At the end of June 1541, the King and Queen set out on a progress to the north of England, and during this time the relationship with Culpepper also progressed. While at Lincoln in early August, Katherine met with him one night in her apartments with Lady Rochford's help and chatted to him until the small hours of the morning, so long in fact that Jane fell asleep. They met again the following night and declared their love for each other. It's tough to see how they could have spent enough time together for this to be genuine love rather than simply lust, but either way they were both now in the most dangerous of waters and had been foolish to let things progress as far as they had. Russell specifically pooh-poohs any idea that Culpepper blackmailed Katherine into seeing him, viewing the relationship as entirely consensual, and Starkey and Fraser do not disagree. As the tour progressed into September, the pair continued to see each other and exchanged gifts, though the practical difficulties around arranging and holding their meetings, and the stress they placed on the Queen, who clearly knew how dangerous her actions were, meant that her strange orders and short temper were noted by her female staff, who found it odd when none of her ladies, except Jane Rochford, were allowed into her rooms unless they had been called for. It was to Culpepper that Catherine's only surviving letter was addressed, and though it is not dated, Russell thinks it comes from this tour when the two were on intimate terms, though Starkey and Fraser both plump for his period of illness in the spring. It reads, Master Culpepper, I heartily recommend me unto you, praying you to send me word how that you do. It was showed me that you was sick, the which thing troubled me very much, till such time that I hear from you, praying you to send me word how that you do. For I never longed so much for a thing as I do to see you, and to speak with you, the which I trust shall be shortly now, the which doth comfort me very much when I think of it, and when I think again that you shall depart from me again, it makes my heart to die, to think what fortune I have that I cannot be always in your company. Yet my trust is always in you, that you will be as you have promised me, and in that hope I trust upon still, praying you then that you will come when my Lady Rochford is here, for then I shall be best at leisure to be at your commandment. Thanking you for that you have promised me to be so good unto that poor fellow my man, which is one of the griefs that I do feel to depart from him, for then I do know no one that I dare trust to send to you, and therefore I pray you take him to be with you, that I may sometime hear from you. One thing I pray you, to give me a horse for my man, for I have had much ado to get one, and therefore I pray send me one by him, and in so doing I am as I said afore, and thus I take my leave of you, trusting to see you shortly again, and I would you was with me now, that you might see what pain I take in writing to you. Yours as long as life endures, Katherine. One thing I had forgotten, and that is to instruct my man to tarry here with me still, for he says, whatsoever you bid him, he will do it. It's difficult to overstate how dangerous Katherine had allowed her situation to become. It seems from their later testimony that she and Culpepper never actually sealed the deal, as it were, but the behaviour of both was reckless, and while I subscribe to the notion that a lot of her activities before her marriage can be forgiven by her youth, and that Duchess Agnes should have taken better care of her, I think by this stage in her life she was old enough and experienced enough to know better, and does deserve much of the blame for the Culpepper affair. The lengths she went to hide it also indicate that she knew full well that she was very much in the wrong. That's not to say that I think she deserved her ultimate fate, because I don't, but there's a tendency in the 21st century to paint her as a complete and utter victim with no agency at all, when in actual fact I think it's more nuanced than that, and I don't believe she was entirely blameless. I know that idea won't be popular with some people, but consider this. Henry VIII's sister Mary, who was first married to the King of France, went on to wed his friend, Henry's friend, Charles Brandon, against her brother's wishes, when she was just shy of 19 and Brandon was about 31. That means she was about the same age, or maybe even younger, than Katherine was in 1541, and I'm not aware of any great movement claiming that Mary, also a queen consort, was a puppet at Brandon's mercy and didn't know what she was doing. She is generally thought of as having been the one pushing that second wedding, and is credited with being old enough to know her mind and understand what she was doing. Why is one woman so often painted as a victim, buffeted by people and events entirely beyond her control, while the other is a girl boss taking ownership of her fate and commended for it? Just something to think about. But back to Katherine. As if her actions in 1541 weren't bad enough, during the latter part of the summer, her past caught up with her too. According to Russell, it was on the 25th of August that Francis Dereham suddenly showed up on the royal tour, though Starkey says he came back into Catherine's life a little earlier in the year in London. Whatever the case may be, she appointed him to her household in what was probably a desperate attempt to keep him quiet, but those around her found it strange that this poorly behaved man, who quarrelled with other servants, took liberties not associated with his position, like hovering over her at dinner when he should have withdrawn, and who had seemingly appeared out of nowhere, was so quickly appointed to her staff. It really didn't help that he alluded to his prior connection with the Queen and seemed determined to show off that he was on intimate terms with her. In short, Francis Dereham was a loud-mouthed, ill-mannered idiot who didn't learn to keep his trap shut even when Katherine, hardly a paragon of discretion or wisdom herself, begged and even paid him to do so. Things were starting to unravel, and within a matter of months they would end in catastrophe, both for the Queen and for some of her closest associates. The royal party arrived back at Windsor on the 26th of October, then moved on to Hampton Court a few days later. It was here that the beginning of the end for Katherine occurred. She continued to see Culpepper and continued to arouse the suspicions of her servants by sending them to Lady Rochford with strange, unintelligible questions which brought back equally strange responses. Then, at the start of November, a man named John Lascelles came to see the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. John's sister Mary had been a servant at Lambeth when Katherine was there, and she had told her brother about the Queen's many premarital indiscretions. Now he told Cranmer. Cranmer wrote the accusations in a letter which he left for the King in his chapel at Hampton Court on the 2nd of November. Initially, Henry claimed that he didn't believe the stories about his wife, but nevertheless he ordered a quiet investigation of the matter. Within 3 days, everyone from John Lascelles and his sister to Henry Manox had been interviewed. Manox in particular spilled everything, giving away far more detail than Mary had been able to provide, though, as Russell says, he doesn't seem to have known that his interviewer's source was Mary and so couldn't tailor his answers to suit only what she knew. He admitted having, quote, felt more than was convenient of Katherine's body, but swore things had not progressed beyond that. Dereham was arrested quickly too, sent to the Tower of London where he was tortured for several weeks, and soon revealed incredibly damaging details about his time with Katherine and how far things had gone between them. No doubt he wished he'd stayed in Ireland, or at least not been so foolish as to pursue her and force his way back into her life. More and more people from the Queen's past were questioned, and the essential uniformity in the stories they told, independently of each other, made it clear that these stories were true, especially as it would have been in the best interests of most of the people to lie and not admit that they knew that the King was marrying an unchaste woman. On the 6th of November, just 4 days after Henry had read Cranmer's letter, he was told that the tales of the Queen's former life were all accurate, and even worse than had been initially suspected. Henry was reduced to tears. Katherine was now confined to her apartments at Hampton Court Palace, and rumours swirled as to what was going on. By now, Dereham's detention in the Tower was increasingly common knowledge. There is a legend that at one point she escaped and ran screaming down the gallery, this gallery in fact if I'm not mistaken, trying to get to Henry to beg for mercy, but it isn't clear if that story is true, and Starkey writes that Henry had left the palace, never to see her again, before Katherine even realised what was happening. On Sunday the 6th, she was interviewed by Cranmer and others, and the accusations put to her that she was pre-contracted to Francis Dereham. Katherine denied everything, but over the course of a few more visits, she confessed. She was completely hysterical with fear on some occasions, and Cranmer described her as in such lamentation and heaviness as I never saw no creature, so that it would have pitied any man's heart in the world to have looked upon her. Henry sent her a message saying that he would show her mercy in exchange for the truth, which intensified her guilt, and eventually it all came pouring out in a series of conversations with the Archbishop. Her first confession is lost. 2 others survive. As Russell says, the second is the less frequently cited of the 2 and indicates that Katherine's relationship with Dereham was consensual. It is because the third and final confession is more often quoted, in which Katherine began to backtrack completely and say that Dereham had aggressively pursued and repeatedly attacked her, that the story that she was horrifically abused has gained such credence. I tend to agree with Russell's assessment, though, that it is the earlier confession of a willing relationship which has the ring of truth to it, especially as it is verified by all the independent witness statements of those who saw the 2 together over an extended period of time. Catherine's decision to hire him again also cast doubt on her version of events from the point of view of her interrogators, and made it look as though she was setting him up to become her lover once more. Now, if we look at things with a Western 21st century approach, we could still argue that Manox and later Dereham were very much in the wrong here, given Catherine's age, but it simply wouldn't have been viewed like that at the time. After all, Henry VIII had actually married her when she was no more than 19, and he'd previously had a teenage mistress in the form of Bessie Blunt when he was in his late 20s. So while I, and I'm sure a lot of you, find the ways in which Catherine was treated by the men in her life very distasteful, to put it mildly, and I think they were using her for their own pleasures, their actions at a time when a girl was considered of marriageable age at 12 simply wouldn't have been viewed as inherently disgusting and wrong, and when Catherine was being honest, she didn't present them as such either. Her youth, lack of good advisors, and the fact that she couldn't really have turned down Henry's proposal or told him of her past without ruining herself would excuse her from virtually all blame for her teenage mistakes if she was alive today, although, as I've already said, I think she certainly was old enough to know better by the time of the Culpepper affair. But they gained her no such leeway in the 16th century. She now wrote to Henry, admitting to her relationships with Manox and Dereham and begging for mercy. But what was her legal position at this point? Well, consensual premarital relations were not a crime, and if Catherine was actually Dereham's wife, then she was guilty of adultery against him, but that on its own wouldn't have led to her death. She was no lawyer, though, and probably didn't appreciate that this might have been her loophole. In any case, considering that her cousin Anne Boleyn was executed on trumped-up charges, I don't think for 1 minute that if she'd admitted being a bigamist and not the real queen, Henry would have allowed her to live, or her paramours. As it was, she never claimed to be Francis's wife anyway. Still, she hadn't admitted to adultery after her marriage with Manox or Dereham, and this is why the affair with Thomas Culpepper became so important. Catherine had mentioned Culpepper in passing to Cranmer, saying that she had had a conversation with Francis Dereham about Thomas's interest in her in late 1539 or early 1540. This tipped the Archbishop off to the fact that there might be a third man worth investigating, and Dereham soon mentioned his rival too. This put Catherine in far greater danger, as the implication was now that she had committed adultery against Henry. Culpepper was arrested on the 12th or 13th of November, and his rooms searched on the 14th. That's why we have the letter I showed you that Catherine wrote to him. When the investigators came to ask Catherine about the couple's meetings during the summer progress, she promptly blamed everything on Lady Rochford for encouraging her to meet up with him, thereby sealing her lady-in-waiting's fate as well. Lady Rochford was spoken to on the 13th, though of course she put more of the blame on her mistress than herself, with both women claiming that they had wanted to disentangle Catherine from Thomas. Jane said that Catherine and Thomas had slept together, but Thomas said that they had never done so, though they had both wanted and intended to. That admission alone was enough to write his death warrant. He was imprisoned in the Tower, as was Lady Rochford, though she quickly had a nervous breakdown and had to be placed in the care of Sir John and Anne Lady Russell, so that she could be brought back to sanity before being killed, it being illegal to execute an insane person. Debate continues as to who was telling the truth. Did Catherine commit adultery with Thomas or not? We'll never know for sure, but you can let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The Queen's household was disbanded, a very ominous sign that there was no going back for her, and on the 14th of November she was sent to the run-down Sion Abbey. It no longer held any nuns, thanks to the English Reformation, and was falling into disrepair. She was given a tiny suite of 3 rooms and allowed to take only a small retinue of servants and goods, including just 6 dresses and 6 deliberately quite basic and undecorated French hoods. The strain on her was immense, and she began to crack under it, refusing to eat, crying constantly, and making her guards concerned enough that they removed anything they thought she could use to hurt herself with. On the 22nd of November, she was stripped of her title of Queen. Pretty much everyone she had ever known before her marriage and during it had now turned against her, including family members such as her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who actually said he hoped she'd be burnt alive, plus her half-sister and former lady-in-waiting, Isabella Baynton. She and her husband were effectively the former Queen's jailers, and Isabella received grants of lands from Henry shortly after Catherine's disgrace, which Russell thinks indicates that she had provided information against her sister. Over a dozen people drawn from Catherine's family and former friends were imprisoned in the Tower, including the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk and the Countess of Bridgewater, but all were ultimately forgiven. There was nothing for Katherine to do now but wait. She did perk up after a few weeks, eating again and making merry, according to the Spanish ambassador Eustace Chapuis, yet she still expected to end her life on a scaffold. She wasn't wrong. Henry Manox escaped punishment, but on the 1st of December, Thomas Culpepper and Francis Dereham were put on trial over their involvement with the Queen and found guilty of treason. Both were executed at Tyburn on the 10th of December. Culpepper was beheaded, but Dereham fared far worse. After further torture between his trial and his death, he was ultimately hung, drawn and quartered, despite having begged for the quicker and more merciful beheading. He didn't have the higher social standing that Culpepper enjoyed, though, and Henry seems to have been in a particularly vicious mood with the man who he assumed had had his wife before him. Both men's heads were stuck on spikes on London Bridge. If they were guilty, then by default Katherine was too. Unlike her cousin Anne, though, she had no separate trial and was instead condemned by an Act of Attainder introduced in the House of Lords on the 21st of January 1542, as was Lady Rochford. The bill was given the royal seal of approval via letters patent on the 11th of February. By then, Katherine had already been moved to the Tower, having had to be physically manhandled into the boat to get her there and having passed underneath the rotting heads of Francis and Thomas on her journey. It was within its walls on the 13th of February that she and Anne Boleyn met their ends. The night before, Katherine asked to have the block brought to her so that she could practice laying her head upon it. Then, between 7 and 9 a.m. the next morning, different sources give different times, she met her fate. She was so weak, according to the French ambassador Charles de Marillac, that she could hardly speak, but she made a calm and dignified end, dying by the axe rather than the sword which Anne Boleyn had perished under. The only surviving eyewitness account as to what happened was written by a man named Otwell Johnson in a letter to his brother John 2 days later. It reads, "For news from hence know ye that even according to my writing on Sunday last, I see the Queen and the Lady Rochford suffer within the Tower the day following, whose souls, I doubt not, be with God, for they made the most godly and Christian's end that ever was heard tell of, I think, since the world's creation, uttering their lively faith in the blood of Christ only, and with goodly words and steadfast countenances, they desired all Christian people to take regard unto their worthy and just punishment with death for their offences, and against God heinously from their youth upwards in breaking all his commandments, and also against the King's royal majesty very dangerously. Wherefore they being justly condemned, as they said, by the laws of the realm and Parliament to die, required the people, I say, to take example at them, for amendment of their ungodly lives, and gladly to obey the King in all things, for whose preservation they did heartily pray, and willed all people so to do, commending their souls to God, and earnestly calling for mercy upon him, whom I beseech to give us grace with such faith, hope, and charity at our departing out of this miserable world, to come to the fruition of his Godhead in joy everlasting. Amen." Otwell's letter blends together their final words so that we don't know who exactly said what, but both followed convention by confessing that they deserved to die. Katherine certainly did not say the famous line, often attributed to her, that she died a queen, but would rather have died the wife of Culpepper. We can piece together some additional details from other sources, even though they were not written by witnesses. Katherine died first, after which her body was covered by a black cloak and moved aside, before Jane followed her former mistress into death, a law having quickly been passed to allow for the execution of the insane. After their deaths, they were presumably buried under the altar in the nearby chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, where Katherine's cousins, Anne and George Boleyn, already lay. When the Victorians were repairing the floor in the 1870s, though, No bones thought to belong to the Queen were located, though a few fragments believed to be Lady Rochford were. I have a video on what may have happened to Catherine's remains, which I'll leave linked for you, so I'll just say here that there is no reason to think that she dissolved in lime as the Victorians assumed. And that brings us to the end of the short life of Katherine Howard, a woman who was most likely no more than 21 years old and perhaps only 18 when she died. Let me know below if you think she actually committed adultery, and for more on her life, death, and afterlife, try one of these videos next. I'll be back next week, and until then, keep learning.